Hi, this is Andy. So let's say you're in a meeting and you're presenting an update on a project and a question comes up. Now you're a bit nervous, and in the moment, you respond in a way that seemed reasonable at the time, but now the meeting's over, you're just kicking yourself thinking, oh, if only I would have said this. So much of what we do when leading teams and projects comes down to communication, whether it's written or spoken with a large audience or an informal conversation or email. Much of our success comes down to how effectively we understand others and are understood by them. Today, I'm joined by one of the foremost communication coaches in the world. Bill McGowan is hired by corporate leaders, athletes, and other celebrities to prepare them for media interviews and major presentations. And he's the author of a book we're going to talk about today entitled Pitch Perfect: How to Say It Right the First Time, Every Time. In today's discussion, we'll learn what it means to be pitch perfect and what it doesn't mean. We'll talk about when it's time for you on the meeting agenda, how you can start your presentation with momentum and keep it more engaging than the typical mind-numbing death by PowerPoint experience. And along the way, Bill will share ideas on how to make your ask to a boss or a client more effective, as well as how to keep your poise during challenging conversations. If you have a team member or colleague that just can't seem to stop talking in meetings, Bill will give you some advice to respectfully yet firmly intervene. It's a discussion I can't wait to share with you. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Bill McGowan about his book, Pitch Perfect. Bill, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Andy, thanks for having me.
Yeah, before we get into the book, I'd love for listeners to learn more about you. You mentioned some stories about your childhood. I specifically remember some about your mom taking you to like a cooking demonstration. You fall in love with cooking. But can you think of anything from your family culture experiences growing up that might have helped form you in some ways to be one of the most trusted communication coaches?
I remember my mother had a motto that she used to share with me pretty often. And she attributed it to Henry Ford. I don't know if it's really Henry Ford or somebody else. The British Royals have kind of co-opted it. Mm-hmm. It's don't complain and don't explain. Mm. And her point of view was that nobody wants to hear you moan and whine on and on about how something can't be done. Just figure out a way to do it, be targeted about it, communicate clearly how you're going to go about making something better, and do it. And don't over explain how you're going to do it. Actions speak louder than words was behind that motto. And I think that that's a really good strategy in business at every single level. Spend more time talking about how to overcome a problem than to getting down into the weeds about why this problem is so difficult to get on top of. I've had lots of bosses in my years in TV who had this mantra of their own, which was just get it done. I didn't want to hear about all the reasons why you can't do it. So I feel as though it's important in business, whether you're reporting to a boss or you're at a meeting, always try to project a positive outcome and talk more about the positive aspects of something rather than talking about how difficult the problem is.
Man, it is so good.
You can acknowledge it, but don't drone on about it.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean be Pollyanna, but it just means it's just so easy to get sucked into that, right? It's like this vortex around the water cooler or to learn that at an early age. What a gift that was, because I think it was apparent and it's so easy for me to not. I have to make sure I'm modeling that, and your mom modeled it.
Yes, and a can-do attitude. Mm-hmm. Also, I learned from a pretty early age how to keep conversations going. I had extended family who weren't exactly talkative, and they were seemingly comfortable with gaps of silence. I wasn't. So I learned how to, in a social way, keep that maybe office party conversation going in a way that Wasn't empty calories, but it also never veered off into territory that you don't want to direct towards. And these relatives were of a different, like we were not like-minded. Let's say that we had different political outlooks, and so I also learned how to validate other people's opinions without necessarily agreeing with them, how to show a certain amount of respect for them, but still be able to put forward my point of view and not create what we've got today. And that is this intense friction that exists when people don't see eye to eye.
Yeah, once again, what a gift. What a gift. You know, we'll talk about many key ideas actually from the book, but let's start here. What does being pitch perfect not mean?
Andy, you're sort of asking me to break one of our cardinal rules, and that is we tell people to talk about what it is, don't talk about what it's not. But I'll indulge you here because we're having a fun conversation.
I appreciate that.
Well, let me start with what it is.
Okay.
Being pitch perfect to me has 4 cornerstone components. It's clarity, brevity, levity, and empathy. Those are the 4 qualities I think go into being pitch perfect. Clarity meaning don't get too granular, don't get down in the weeds, don't suffer from the curse of knowledge. Keep things simple, straightforward, easy to chew and digest for people. Simon Sinek, I know you're familiar with his work. He's got a great quote that it's simple ideas that resonate with people. It's simple ideas that get repeated, and ideas that get repeated have an opportunity to really change the world. And I totally agree with that. Brevity, Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit. And it's absolutely true. I think Lincoln had a quote, something to the effect of, it's better to remain silent and be thought of as a fool than to speak too much and remove all doubt.
Right.
And I think that being able to say things in a concise way is respectful to other people. Everybody's time is valuable. And when you chew up other people's time by taking too long to get to the point, it leaves people with an uneasy feeling. It makes them feel antsy. Like, can we just move this on, please? And it lowers their perception of your professionalism, your executive presence, and all those things that we want to possess. Levity, there have been some very interesting studies in Stanford that show that if you inject a little fun, a little humor into your presentation or into what you have to contribute in a meeting, that engagement and retention shoot way up. And I'm not saying tell jokes, but I am saying find an interesting, lighthearted lens at one point to be able to see things through. And, listen, a lot of the meetings we have to sit through in the business world can be pretty dry. And if you give people an opportunity to just have a little bit of a laugh, I think it's an ultimate gift. And then empathy, it's not about you. It's about them. It's about your audience. It's about the people you're talking to. Understand what is it they want to walk away from this interaction with? What information? What motivation? What inspiration? What am I giving them that's ultimately valuable? And I find that when you make that the focus, what happens is your energy rises. Energy, in our definition of clarity, is the palpable enthusiasm for the value of the information you're sharing with people. It's not about talking louder, talking faster, flailing your arms, any of that. It's about how visibly enthused do I seem that this is going to be some of the most valuable minutes you've spent all week hearing what I have to say. That's what you need to psych yourself up to believe when you walk into any meeting or you give any presentation. I think sometimes we walk in with a defeatist attitude, and there's this little evil voice on our shoulder that tells us that everybody in the audience is bored and they can't wait for you to finish. And that really undermines you. So think of it as those: clarity, brevity, levity, empathy.
I really appreciate you summarizing it that way, because I guess some books, Bill, my observation is be like me. This is how I do it. This is not about try to be like Bill, although you've got great stories to illustrate. It's not about being or having the great communicator gene, like you say in the book. And also, something else I appreciate about the book, it's not about here are templated scripts. follow these templated scripts and you'll just be pitch perfect, right? It's not a book like that at all.
I was very important to me because we do this in the training sessions we run as a company. We don't try to change people. We want them to feel like they're still inside their own skin, which is really important, because when you try to put everybody into one mold, then they lose what everybody today refers to with authenticity. And that is really a recipe for failure. You have to let people feel like they're just being their best selves in front of a room. So not everybody is dramatic and dynamic when they speak. So we coach people on how to make the content dynamic, even if your delivery is not. There are lots of different ways to engage and hook an audience. You know, one of the things that we feel is really important, as I mentioned with brevity, is an economy of words. And this is true in speeches and emails. It's the concise communicator I find that is often the most respected. And I often challenge people to think, put yourself on a word diet just for a week.
That's good.
Okay, so,
I love it.
so we speak about 16,000 words a day.
Yeah.
And imagine if I told you, okay, this week or today, you get 12,000 words.
Yeah.
You got to lose 4,000. And I tell you that at the beginning of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine how much more selective you'd be if you realize that come 3 o'clock, you may run out of words. And that has been really helpful for some people, realizing that there is not an infinite supply I can, draw from.
Yeah, I love it. I love the metaphor, because I think if I really analyzed some of my day, there was a lot of junk food, right?
A lot of empty calories, and I think we all suffer from that.
Yeah. So that's a great metaphor. That the interesting thing to me is that we're not talking to celebrities here. We're not talking to people doing media interviews. For the most part, we're doing TED Talks, but it's so fundamental to people leading projects and people that we have to do a good job to communicate. So to help our listeners just get a taste of what's included in your book, I'd like to pass some scenarios by you. We're not going to hit all 7 of your principles of persuasion. No. I'd like to hit some of them, right? They need to get the book to get all that. But let's say a listener is on the agenda to present. Let's say it's a project update to some senior leaders, and to maybe raise the stakes a little bit. The project's not going perfectly. I mean, not terrible, but there's some issues. It's starting to drift off the original plan. So the first of your 7 principles of persuasion is the headline principles, or the headline principle. And what are some mistakes that people too often make when it's their turn? It's now you're on the agenda, the mic is being passed to them, so to speak. And what are some ways you coach people to start their presentations well?
Think of starting a presentation the way you would hand a book to somebody. I've never known anybody to say, wow, I can't wait to devour that table of contents, before chapter 1. That has never been said. And to me, the table of contents is the agenda slide. It is ubiquitous in the business world. And to me, that is an absolute snoozer. That is not a way to hook an audience. And we find in our work that probably one of the most common challenges we try to help people overcome is all this talking about what we're going to talk about. And I know that McKinsey was very successful in making this the formula about tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. And we think of that formula as being very dated and dusty. It's been used to death. And we feel as though it's important to figure out what's a declarative, concise statement that I'm going to lead this presentation with, that's engaging, that's thought-provoking. I saw an interview recently with Francis Ford Coppola, and he had this very interesting answer to a question. He said, I learned a lot about directing from some of the greats, and one of the most valuable things I learned is figure out what your 3 best components are of your movie, of your story, of your presentation. What are the 3 strongest elements you've got? Take the strongest one and make it the end. Take your second strongest one and make it the beginning. And take your third strongest one and find some logical place in the middle to insert it. And I could not agree more. I think you absolutely have to hook your audience with something compelling, something thought-provoking, instead of this introductory. So I'm Bill McGowan. I want to talk a little bit today about good public speaking, and then I'm going to answer some questions. But before I do that, let me take a couple steps back and walk you through. Oh my God. That's 99% of all presentations that you hear. Stop warning people about what you're about to do. So to prove that point, let me share with you an anecdote. Just go right into the story. We call it signposting. And there's way too much signposting in most people's presentations, whether it's in a meeting or in front of a board or in front of just your employees. Do it. Don't warn people that you're going to do it.
I love that.
In fact, I had a session last week or the week before. There were 6 people. We were working on presentation skills. And I said to them, I'll make a challenge with each of you. I will take to dinner, or I forget what I bribed them with, but I said, if anybody can make it through their presentation without saying the words, I want to talk about, I said, I guarantee you can't do it. And this is before I heard any of them give their presentation. And sure enough, not one of them, even being aware of it, could sidestep and swerve around that. It's so ingrained.
That's what we see. You actually have an acronym for the agenda setting start to make it memorable. The ASS. It just cracked me up because that made it memorable for me. Of like, and the other thing I see a lot, just interested in your take on this, is oh, it's so good to be here. Oh, it's great to. I think it's not exactly the gratuitous gratitude thing that you talk about, but once again, it's just fluff. Or one person said at our company, we call it the we do, which is kind of childish, but it's like, hi, I'm Andy Kaufman. What our company does, we do this, we do this, we do this, and it's nothing about them. It's all about us, which maybe goes to your empathy point too.
Absolutely. That's so funny. The other one is, I'm so excited to be here. It's such an exciting time for the company. I think we have a very exciting lineup of innovation coming this year. Excited is maybe the most overused word. And the other challenge that I find in beginning, let's say you're talking to 20 people in your audience, you know that there's going to be the need to say thank you, and that you've been looking forward to this opportunity. And then you've got the content of slide 1. And I find that most people have no idea how to get from the pleasantries to the presentation. There's this chasm. There's this gap between the two that most people leave to just winging it, whatever pops into their head in the moment, which ultimately leads to, okay, so let's get started, which is not the smooth transition that ultimately you would like. We recommend to the people we work with, map out what those steps are very naturally, very conversationally, very casually, but you have to know what your route is from the pleasantries to the presentation. Otherwise, you'll find yourself in that awkward, okay, let's get started type of scenario that 90% of presenters end up doing.
Yeah, that's good. As I remember somebody, and she said, this is too formulaic, I think, but I'd be interested in your taking this. She goes, start a presentation with a question that almost everyone in the audience would say yes to. Like, have you ever found yourself, and it'd be a question that they'd be like, and she goes, her take was, that is a bit of a hook because they go, oh, this seems relevant to me. You know? So, but actually she said 3 questions. And I think at that point, it's too formulaic, but
people love 3s.
Right.
They're obsessed with 3.
Right. That's a good point.
And sometimes they work, but sometimes it's a little too much.
But
anything that gets the audience mentally chewing on something is a good thing.
There you go. I like it. Yeah. My recollection of the Scorsese principle is that we make our communication more memorable and engaging if we make the points visual. Like you did that when you talked about going on a diet. That was visual to me. I appreciate that. Or using metaphors like that, or storytelling. one of the many valuable ideas in a chapter on the Scorsese principles, the 6 clues that you've lost your audience. And so I'd be interested in some examples you sharing that. What should we watch for? And what do you say to the person who goes, I'd love to tell more stories or use metaphors, but this is a corporate presentation, not a TED Talk, Bill. So how does this apply to me?
Just because you're presenting dry material doesn't mean that there isn't a need to make it interesting. In fact, there's more of a need to make it interesting
for sure.
if you've got dry material. And one of the devices that we love to suggest to our clients is, let's think of an analogy here. Let's think of a way to compare what may be granular, dry, unfamiliar, foreign to your audience and get them to understand and appreciate it quickly by comparing it to something common to all of our experiences. So, for instance, the other day, I was working with a company that is prominent in trying to fix the supply chain problem that was really intense about 12 to 18 months ago. And supply chain there are 2 words that make everybody's eyes over, right?
Wow.
So I said, well, let's think of it, to get people to understand it. Let's think of it as, we had essentially a 6-lane freeway that was getting squeezed into a 1-lane country road. And, to give people that visual of this bottleneck of materials and goods that were trying to come into the country and just couldn't. So one of my favorites historically was Colin Powell when he was the Secretary of State, or maybe he was the Defense Secretary at the time. They asked him, what is your opinion of us going into Iraq? Do you think that that's a good idea? Now, he could have given this dry, wonky, policy-driven answer about regime change in the Middle East, which how many people really would have found that compelling? But he didn't. He started with what we call a creative label, which was, well, keep in mind, this is the Pottery Barn principle. If you break it, you own it. There's the analogy. Maybe nobody understands regime change in the Middle East, but they totally get walking into a store, knocking something over and having to pay for it. Everybody gets that. It's probably one of the most quotable remarks of the past 15, 20 years. The Pottery Barn principle, in fact, lived on as a concept, so much so that I think Pottery Barn wrote a cease and desist letter because they did not want, their brand being so closely tied to war. But analogies are a great way to make your content compelling. I was coaching a group of people in finance to do a panel discussion on Brexit, which can be about as dry as a bone. And this one guy, when he was talking about Theresa May, who was the prime minister before Boris, said, well, listen, before she left office, she was the chess player only at the king left. And she was just moving it around one space at a time until she got checkmated. I don't remember anybody else on that panel that day. I don't remember what anybody else on that panel said that day, but I do remember that guy. And I think one of the best goals we can try to achieve is being memorable, not just being messaged, but being memorable. Because there's so much noise out there, and it's very hard to make your point of view and what you have to say and share rise above all that noise.
That's so good. That's so good. When it comes to the signs we've lost people, I think they're the obvious ones. If someone's like doing the you call it the hand windmill, or if they're looking at their watch or their phone, that's some obvious ones.
But chatting with the person next to them, it's an interesting device. If you feel as though you are losing your audience, take a longer than usual pause, maybe 2 beats.
Oh, that's good.
And what you're going to find is the cessation of sound suddenly makes people, what happened?
Yeah, right.
They snap their head around looking because they heard something change. And right before they're likely to think something's wrong, you resume.
That's good. Yeah, it's very practical. And real quick, another thing I took that I think is related to this out of your book is, you might think, well, I'm not as snappy as that person with the pawn or the Pottery Barn, but you talk about carry a notebook around with you. Huh?
Yeah.
And so if you carry a notebook around with you, or if you do it electronically and you hear a
Mhm.
good metaphor, it's not like there's a copyright on that necessarily, or if you want to give attribution to it, you can. But I don't know. What do you, anything you want to say about that idea?
Yeah, these notebooks, I know we're on a podcast, but I have moleskins that are filled page after page after page with little gems I hear from other people.
Yeah, yeah,
And I like to share them with other clients.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so uh, it's, I find if I don't write something down right away,
Yeah.
gone. There's no way I'm going to remember.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And if you see people on these Sunday news shows, whether it's Meet the Press or Face the Nation or whatever it is, what I've come to realize is very little of what they're doing is spontaneous. What they're doing is they're going on with a compilation of greatest hits of the catchiest, most clever things they've either said or heard all week long inside the Beltway. And they're just borrowing great stuff from each other.
Yeah.
And repurposing good material is another key to good communication. Sometimes people feel like, well, I said that last meeting. Yeah, I've already used it. Can't use it again. I disagree. I think consistency and hammering home a point makes it more effective.
Yeah, what's the phrase? R&D is rip off and duplicate. So keep your little your journal around to do that. And
Right.
And this applies maybe a little bit to your pasta sauce principle too, because let's say a listener they were told they're going to get 30 minutes on the agenda. I'd imagine some interviews they're told, all right, you're going to get 3 minutes with Anderson Cooper, or I mean, 10 minutes with Anderson Cooper. You're only going to get 3. Whatever. I think things get compressed. So let's say our listener, they thought they're going to get 30. Now they're only going to get 15. And so what are some mistakes to avoid, and how do you coach people to deal with situations like this?
Whatever you do, don't speed up.
Right.
Don't go into it thinking, wow, I've got a lot of material here. I better like step on the gas and blow through this. Yeah. Once you start going too fast, lots of bad things happen. You typically have more filler language. You lose your audience because there's no variation of pace. Going brisk and slow is a great way to engage the ear of the audience. We always tell our clients, we want you to be shorter and slower rather than longer and faster. If it means that you have to cut content way back in order to give yourself the luxury of taking your time with it, so be it. That's a much better strategy to go in with a plan B. And that means literally you're going into a meeting and you know that whoever the project manager is going to wheel around and say, so Andy, what's your take on this? Realize that I want to be concise to begin with, but if the meeting's running long, how can I take a 2-minute contribution that I plan to make? Do I have a 20-25-second version? And it means having that backup plan. I used to prep people a lot, magazine editors, to go on the Today Show and do these, what they call these demo segments. And I'm sure we've all seen them, the 5 great gifts to give for Father's Day. And, the things are all on a table, and
sure.
Hoda's taking people through them and they want an explanation of each one of them.
Right.
And what we would do for that 5th and final example on the table, I'd say, okay, you're accustomed to taking about 45 seconds to describe this. Let's also have an 8-second version or a 10-second version, because you know what's going to happen. We're going to get to the end of the table and Hoda's going to say, okay, Bill, quickly, just tell me what this means. And she means, if you don't give it to me in 12 seconds, I'm cutting you off. That's what quickly means in TV. So we would have an 8-second version for that last item on the table so that the editor didn't seem rushed and out of control and frazzled and frantic. And you always want to project a calm, I'm controlling the clock, not the other way around.
So good. And, sometimes it's not that we're cut from 30 to 15. Sometimes what happens is it's more interactive maybe than what we planned. And I think you use a ratio in some of your training, don't you? I think you mentioned in the book that if you're planning on being interactive, you have to allocate that time for the interactivity.
Yes, absolutely. it's hard, and that's hard to judge
Mhm.
because you don't know how vocal the people around the conference table are going to be. You don't know how many questions they're going to have. Sometimes when I go into a new client situation, I ask the representative, do they typically engage a lot? Do they like to ask questions as they go? Because if they do, I'm going to cut far further back on the deck
Yeah.
to allow more time. But I don't want to be in a situation where I've cut a 30-minute presentation back to 20 minutes because I'm anticipating questions and there are none. So try to get a little bit of a scouting report if you can, but realize that you are going to have to adjust that deck for interaction, which is great.
Yeah. Although I do remember you said in the book that if you get done early, at least in a lot of corporate settings, people are going to praise your name, right? I mean, as a
You're their new
just fill it that
personal
way.
hero.
All
If
right.
you
Yeah.
send them back to their desk 10 minutes ahead of time and
Yeah.
disrupt the back-to-back meetings,
Yeah.
which drive
Yeah.
people nuts.
Yeah. So a client recently told me that she went into her boss's office and she was going to make an ask, and she made the mistake of saying, you're probably going to say no, but. And thankfully, she had a good boss who just stopped her in mid sentence, like, no, 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 no. That's a bad way to start. And your conviction principle chapter, which I loved, you talked about phrases of equivocation like these. So what are some others that we just need to start listening for and avoid them?
Projecting success is always important. You're probably not going to go for this, but, or I'm sure somebody else has had this idea before, but these sentences, while we may on the surface think make us seem humble, undermine us and they cut our conviction. There are lots of words that also compromise that. I try to get people to reduce or eliminate the number of times they say, I think. Try to remove that, and you will find that what you have to say is crisper. It has a greater degree of certainty to it. The other scourge that's out there right now is kind of and sort of. These have become ubiquitous filler words. And there are legitimate times where they work and they make sense in a sentence. But if you're going to say to somebody in a meeting, so after a lot of consideration, this is kind of the strategy that we came up with. No, it's not kind of the strategy. It is the strategy. It sounds like you're almost apologizing for it before it's had a chance to prove itself. So those are two things that I think are are good to eliminate. The other one is what I call the rhetorical right. You say a sentence, and right, you're constantly asking for that affirmation at the end of every thought. This has become an incredibly widespread habit, which is really good to break if you're susceptible to it.
Yeah. I feel like on media interviews, almost every answer starts with, well, look, or listen. Yeah. But this is
so
one. Yeah, right.
So are the first two words of every sentence today. And is a good way to break the habit of that. And that is, when you finish sentence one, don't utter any sound until you can, in your mind's eye, visualize what the first 3 or 4 words of the next sentence are. And if you're going to be very, very selective and intentional about what those are not going to be the first two. Right. You will not intentionally select those words. Now, if it means having a beat pause, a beat and a half pause in between sentences, so be it. To me, the most confident people in the room are the ones that look the most comfortable with silence. It's usually the junior, inexperienced people who feel the need to fill every audio nook and cranny in the room and never give the ear of the people around the table a break.
Yeah, that's good. I would say something I picked up out of your book that I will fall into is, hey, I only want to take 2 minutes of your time. Or, hey, I know lunch is just ahead. Right? Aren't those some examples of these same
Yeah.
sorts of things? You're telling them like, oh yeah, I guess I am hungry.
I'm just going to quickly walk you through this. Quickly, in our mind, is an apologetic word. It assumes they're not interested. I'm telling you, I'm not going to take a lot of time doing this, so you'll be bored for less time. That's what quickly means. And in conferences, in offsites that we have as companies where a group of people get up and present, I've heard people apologize for every slot in the day. The 9 o'clock person is apologizing for the fact that it's early in the morning. Everybody's probably a little bleary eyed. The 11:30 person is apologizing because he knows everybody's hungry and is just thinking about lunch. Right. The 2 o'clock person, she's apologizing because everybody's in that post-lunch stupor. Then, of course, we've all heard the listen, I know I'm the only thing standing between you and the cocktail hour. Those all should go. Never apologize, ever.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so obvious when you say it, but in that conviction principle chapter, you also talked a lot about body language. And I'm just curious because Zoom and Teams were not as popular right when you wrote the book. And so a lot of this communication is done like you and I are doing right now over a tool like that. Any ways that you coach people differently about, or maybe it's the same, but when it comes to body language, vocal tone, stuff like that, when they're doing it virtually?
There are a number of ground rules that we'd like to take people through. And among them is just how you're framed in your Zoom or your Teams shot. I find a lot of people put their laptop on a desk in front of them, which is lower than eye level. So the webcam shoots up at them. And I see a lot of ceilings, a lot of ceiling moldings behind people's heads. I call it the paramedics pose because if I fainted on the street, I'd probably see somebody, hovering over me, checking my vital signs. And that's what a lot of Zoom shots look like. People almost like on top of their webcam. That's one. People also leave too much headroom between the top of their head and the top of the frame. And you minimize your authority and your executive presence sitting too low in the shot. Try to minimize that. Don't sit in front of a white wall. It can look like a hostage video. Don't sit too close to your bookshelf because I'm going to stop listening to you and start reading the spines of your book and see what's on your reading list. Eye contact, really important. Try to put the thumbnails of the participants of the call right under the webcam so that you can look at them if you want to, but it's not off to the side here. Zoom sets up its default setting of thumbnails of the people on the call vertically down the right side of the screen. There is the opportunity to click and drag that thread, that chain, up horizontally to the top of the screen, which keeps your eye closer to the webcam. Yeah. Now, one of the things that I've discovered is that the dynamic of reading a room is different. You can read a room, but you cannot read a Zoom. That is what I've come to appreciate. And that is, people just look disengaged and bored on virtual meetings. It may not be because they are, but it's just a different forum. And if they look off to the side and they're scribbling something, you may think they're texting their friends and they've totally tuned you out. They could be taking really copious notes about everything you're saying, but to you, it doesn't look that way. You can't see the whole picture. And I found early on in the pandemic on Zoom that I was too often looking off to the side to the participants in the call to get that affirmation that this is working, it's connecting, they're engaged. And I wasn't getting it because you don't get that on Zoom. And I realized it's starting to become too much of a distraction. It's taking my mind off the task at hand, and that's being clear and concise about the presentation I'm giving. So at one point, I just decided I'm going to close all the windows. Just close them all. Close mine even, because I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I'm so self-conscious because now I see myself all the time. Close them all and treat it like a conference call.
Mm.
and try to make sustained, meaningful eye contact with the webcam. And I found my confidence shot way up
That's good.
when I did that.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Taking control. I like that. One guest told me, she says, "Fall in love with that little light next to your camera." I thought that was a memorable way to think of it. Is I love you. Yeah,
you know what's a good trick for that
yeah,
is take a little 3x3 photograph of
mm,
someone who you feel very comfortable talking to,
yeah,
punch a couple of holes in the photograph, and then affix the holes over the webcam and just
clever.
tape it into place. Now, what that does is it gives you somebody to talk to.
Super clever. Yeah. I like that. Yeah, in my opinion, the curiosity principle chapter easily worth the price of the book on its own. And I think this issue I talked about in the intro about the person that won't stop talking is something that we deal with
Yeah.
in meetings. I can think of this leadership group. It was almost hilarious to watch because this one person, when we start talking, everyone would just go to their phones because they had learned in a short amount of time that when that train leaves the station, it's not coming back for a long time.
Right.
So if whether it's a panel that we're leading or we're facilitating the meeting, some strategies for us to deal with that person that just keeps droning on.
Interestingly, we discovered through the trainings we do with people who have to moderate panels. This is a real problem. If you are the one entrusted with keeping a panel conversation going, which is not unlike running a meeting, if you think about it.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
And there's always one relentless airbag in the room who just is so enamored with the sound of their own voice and just can't get enough of it. And what we coach moderators to do is look for that opportunity to finish their sentence for them. And you'd be surprised how often you're able to really tap in and predict how the thought concludes. And this is something that's surprisingly not rude. It's how we talk in real life. We affirm and amend what the other person's saying by jumping in and in some ways jumping the punchline a little bit, but it's very natural in conversation. If you do that, you finish their thought for them and pull it away from them and direct it somewhere else. That's a great way to cut them off.
I like it.
Never ever make it about, yeah, Jen, listen, this is all great stuff, but we only got 5 minutes left of this meeting, and never make it about time or I've lost control of the flow of the meeting. That just reflects poorly on you.
That's good. It's respectful. Yeah, that's a simple little strategy, and there's more for everyone listening in the chapter. But that is I picked up on that one as well. That's really helpful.
And as you said, see, I just did it to you, right? And respect is really crucial to be demonstrating in any communication situation. It goes back to what we said earlier. Being concise is respectful. It's realizing this person does not have infinite amount of time. I'm going to free you up. I'm going to tell you what you need to know. I'm going to let you go.
I love it. So many other things I'd love to talk to you about, but let's end with this. We've got a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. Can you think of any ways that you tried with, I get the impression from the book, you're now grown children, how you tried to maybe get some of these principles into place for them as they're growing up?
I have tried valiantly to make sure that the word said, S-A-I-D, does not become the word like. And then I was like, well, let's go to the movies. And then she was like, well, no, maybe we should say like does not mean said. That's a principle that I've been very passionate about over the years. I've also tried to instill, not just in my own children, but children of friends of mine. Some of them I've coached for speeches they've had to give or bar mitzvah speeches. As a favor, I'll work with them. And one of the most common traps I find young people fall into is thinking that going as fast as humanly possible and not making a mistake is a badge of honor. And let me show you how fast I can do this without tripping up. And I'm really working to get them to downshift, understand that the masters take their time. This is not some test about how quickly you can get it done or how fast you can go without stumbling. The most confident people tend to be very deliberate, very emphatic in how they talk. Barack Obama was the master and still is the master of this. He never lets the speed of his speaking pace force his brain into a bad decision. And what I mean by that is he's selective and thoughtful about everything he wants to say before he opens his mouth to utter sound. And that's why he's such an effective communicator. That also is key to getting rid of filler, like kind of, so all of those filler words are the product of people speaking too fast and feeling the need to utter sound before they've actually chosen what it is they want to say.
But we use this term in our family called, when someone asks you a question, you have to throw the ball back. And you use, I think, different terminology, but it's the same idea of show interest in the other person, not just in yourself, be the person talking. And so I think that's an easy thing to train kids on. I mean, it's not easy, but it's an easy idea. Throw the ball back. And if they throw the ball back to you, throw the ball back. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. And listening is not just the interval of time that you're waiting to say the next thing you want to say. Mm-hmm. That is not what listening is. Listening is absorbing what the other person has to say, finding the value in it, seeing if you can build off of that or remark on it, keeping it. That's how you make a conversation interactive. It's not monologue versus monologue. Right. That's not a conversation.
Right. That's good. Well, for those listening, so much of what we do as leaders of people and projects is related to communication. And if this discussion has resonated with you, get a copy of Bill McGowan's book, Pitch Perfect. I put links to the book and Bill's company in the show notes for this cast. So, Bill, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Andy, thanks very much. I had a lot of fun.